A simple phone call. We get them every day, right? But in 1993, a series of late-night calls to an Air Force captain would blur the line between prank and paranormal. The caller knew things they shouldn't know, spoke in ways that weren't quite human, and left behind something most mysteries don't have: actual proof. Welcome to the In-Between. I'm Carol Ann, and today we're diving into the chilling case of what has become known as the Sudbrink Calls. Hey, it's Carol Ann. You know the drill. Leave your deets at the beep and I'll call you back as soon as I can. Answering machines. The bane of the 90s, right? Well, hate him if you want, but it's an answering machine that gives this strange case something most mysteries don't have: proof. But proof of what? 30 years later, that question is still unanswered. But before I get too deep, let's go back to the beginning. This story brings us all the way back to 1993, February 7th to be exact. Gary Sudbrink is a 27-year-old Air Force captain stationed in Texas. Texas is great, but he'd rather be in Long Island, New York, where his mom, dad, and two brothers, Stephen and Brian, all live. Lucky for him, he sees a few empty days on his calendar and decides to fly home to surprise his family with a visit. So, not telling anyone, he heads to the airport on February 7th, wearing his uniform with a sweater on top to catch his flight home. While he's waiting at the gate, he's approached by a regular-looking guy who strikes up a regular conversation. As the airline starts calling Rose for boarding, the guy whips out a notepad and asks for Gary's name. Gary says, "Gary." And then the guy asks for his last name. Thankfully for Gary, the sweater he had on covered his military name tag, because this guy has instantly weirded him out. Gary says, I don't think so, and leaves to board the plane. Once he's seated in his window seat and is settled in, a different guy comes by, sits down on the aisle seat, and starts chatting with Gary. Again, nothing exceptional about the conversation. Another passenger comes by and says, "You're sitting in my seat." So the guy moves over one to the middle seat and keeps chatting. Another passenger comes by, says, "You're sitting in my seat." And the flight attendant tells the guy he's got to go to his assigned seat. The guy gets up, but instead of going to his seat, he stands behind Gary's seat, which is the wider emergency exit row, continuing the chat and asking Gary for his name. Doesn't take long before the flight attendant chases the guy back to his own seat, and Gary finally has some peace. Once the flight arrives at LaGuardia Airport, and much to his relief, Gary does not see the man when he's getting off the plane or at baggage claim. But between those two guys, Gary's now paranoid that it may be some ploy to figure out how long he's going to be out of town so they can rob his apartment. So he puts in a call to his landlord, asking them to keep an eye on his place just in case. He makes his way to his parents' house and all is well. The next day, Monday, February 8th, is pretty uneventful. That night, around 10:30 p.m., Gary decides to surprise his good friend Mike, tell him he's in town, and see if they can make some plans to see each other while Gary's in the area. He calls Mike. "I'm in town." "I know." "How do you know?" "You told me yesterday." "I didn't talk to you yesterday." "Yes, you did. You called me to let you know that you were flying into JFK, but that you have a bit of a cold, so you weren't sure if we were going to be able to get together." "I didn't fly into JFK, and I feel fine." "Well, that's what you told me." Before Gary can wrap his head around what Mike is saying, he hears the call waiting beep in his ear. Someone else is calling the Sudbrinks. So Gary tells Mike to hang on and answers the incoming call. The voice he hears and the things being said by the caller are so bizarre that Gary hits the record button on the Sudbrink answering machine to record what is happening. Before I play this recording, just so you know, you're also going to hear Gary's mom and dad each pop on at different times as well. And there are places in the recording that are very difficult to hear. This is what is recorded.
I'll tell you who it is.
Hello?
Yeah. Do you want to speak to him?
Gary's Sudbrink there.
Yeah, who's this? Steven? Are you playing games with me or what? Huh? Steven, if you're playing games, I'm going to kick your ass.
So how long are you going to be back from Texas?
Huh?
You're being impersonated by the other voice.
Yeah, this is you, Steve, you idiot. You pissed me off. Jerk. I'm going to get you on... Let's see what it says. Review. One new call out of area. Is Steven out of the area?
How long are you going to be back from Texas?
Wait, say that again?
You're being impersonated by the other voice.
Wait, hold on. Is Steven out of the calling area or what? What do you mean you don't know? He's in Queens. I don't know who the...
Hello?
Hello?
Here's Gary's Sudbrink there.
Who is this? That looks like a robot.
Hello?
How long are you going to be back from Texas?
What was that again, sir?
You're being impersonated by the other voice.
Oh, be quiet now, huh? Sorry, would you see that again? Hello? Being impersonated by what voice?
Hello?
Yeah. Hello?
Here's Gary's Sudbrink there.
Yeah, hold on a second. Yeah, what is your question? I'll answer it.
So how long are you going to be back from Texas?
How long?
You're being impersonated by the other voice.
Right. When am I coming back? Is that your question? Okay, there was a break. Hold on. You want to know when I'm coming back to Texas? Oh, is that your question?
So how long are you going to be back from Texas?
How long am I going to be back from Texas? That question doesn't make any sense.
By the other voice.
Okay. I'll be coming back eventually. I can't tell you when. You should know that question, the answer to the questions, because you seem to know more about me than I do. You know what I'm saying?
Are you an intergalactic person?
Are you a space alien?
Sounds like you hung up.
I can't believe this.
He hung up, Gary.
See if he comes back.
All right, I'll hang up.
I don't know about you, but that is one of the creepiest things I have ever heard. Just a note that when Gary's mentioning Steven, he's talking about his older brother. He thinks it's his brother punking him. And I don't know if he ever called Mike back or not, but according to Gary, he then sits down with his parents talking about how weird that was when at 11:10, the phone rings again. Once Gary figures out it's the same caller, he hits record on the answering machine again.
What is your question? Yes, speaking. Yes. Can I answer any questions for you?
Are you back from Texas?
Not back yet, no.
How long are you going back from Texas?
Let me answer. First, you tell me, where are you calling from?
This is Gary's Sudbrink.
Yeah, why don't you tell me where you're calling from?
Who is this?
What do you mean, who is this? You should know who it is. It's me, Gary. Wait, let me ask you this question. Where are you calling from? Okay, I'll be back. Excuse me? I can't hear too well. Yeah, there's a full moon out. That's true. Could you identify yourself? Identify yourself. Why are you calling me? Excuse me? I cannot hear too well. Hold on, let me switch phones. Okay. Okay, hold on. Now, who are you? Keep an eye in the sky, he said.
Keep an eye in the sky?
Yeah.
Shh.
Okay, hold on. Say that. Repeat that again. Please repeat. Okay. Near Orion.
Holy mackerel. Tonight or just when?
It's a full moon.
They told
Repeat. Okay, repeat last word. I'm hearing static.
Tell him I like to do.
He hung up. Hello?
The voice is so mechanical sounding, and it's so quiet at times, like it's running out of juice. But don't go off into Sherlock Holmes mode just yet. We're not done. At 11:38, so just a couple of minutes later, the phone rings again. And just a heads up, when Gary's dad mentions Brian, he's just accidentally calling Gary by his little brother's name.
Okay. Yeah, it's taking time from the talk. Who is this? Stephen, this is not funny, you know.
Brian, it's not Steven.
What do you mean, Brian?
I mean, Gary.
How do I know it's not Stephen?
It's not Steven.
Hello?
I had a UFO experience in West Virginia, which you probably know. And I know that you're into an intergalactic person. Can you speak a little louder? Sir? Can you speak a little louder? Louder?
Let me speak to him, Dad. I guess I don't know what.
All right, I'll hang up so you can talk to him. He wants to talk to you.
Okay. Hello, can I help you? Yes. Yes, that's me. Yes, could you please identify yourself? Identify. Yeah, I'm back. I'm in Texas right now. Oh, he asked me a question. No, I'm in New York right now. You know that. Why are you asking me such a question? Yes. Stephen, if this is you, I swear to God, I'm going to be pissed. Huh? I'm trying to listen to him. Excuse me? Okay. Eventually, I'll be back from Texas. Could you speak more? Please speak more. I guess it's not Steven. I believe it because I'm getting static. Let me go on this phone because I can never hear on this phone. Hold on. Okay. Okay, please speak. Hello? Okay. Should I go out right now? Right now? Okay, see, I'm not sure where Orion is now, but we'll go outside. It would show double from me. Repeat that again?
Wow, that's insanity. The third call turns out to be the last of the evening, so the Sudbrink family heads to bed for the night, although I would bet that none of them got much sleep. The next day, it's uneventful until 10:21 that night. The phone rings and, you guessed it, it's our mysterious anonymous caller. In this phone call, you are also going to hear Gary's Uncle Tom pop in for a moment.
Yes, this is me. Can I speak to you? Can I ask why you're... Yes, can I ask why you're calling? Can I please ask... Yes, this is. Yes, that is me. Say that again? Leave? I'm staying right here. Is this a joke or what? I have to think about that. I'd like to see you.
Hey, let me tell you something. I've been listening to you, and I've had contacts with you.
Government interference? You have? Please explain what type of interference. Okay.
The sun will rise from the dark side of the moon.
Okay, what branch of the government? What should I do? Okay. Is that good for me or bad? They hung up.
Yeah.
And with that, the call is over, and our strange, creepy caller is never heard from again. Now, it's important to note that Gary's dad and his Uncle Tom, who got on the line there for a bit, are way into the UFO phenomena. Gary's dad even had his own sighting in West Virginia a while back. He and Tom drove to Green Bank, West Virginia to see the telescope that had collapsed. They drove in separate cars, so Tom wasn't around when Gary's dad happened to spot a flying object that looked like a hat with a band around it, about the size of a small VW, hovering just 20 or 30 feet from his car before it blinked out of existence. So if you're thinking that his question in the first phone call as to whether or not the caller is an intergalactic person seemed random, now you know why. But I have to say, when you listen to that recording, don't visions of E.T. and Men in Black start swirling through your head? Of course, the caller's mention of things like keep your eyes on the sky and to be within this planet kind of make it almost impossible not to think that. Understandably, most people think it's a hoax. If you speed up the voice, it actually sounds like a regular person.
Hello? How long are you going to be back from Texas?
The movie Home Alone 2, Lost in New York, came out just 2 months before this, which featured little Kevin pulling a fast one on the hotel staff using something called a talk boy.
This is Peter McAllister, the father.
Yes, sir.
I'd like a hotel room, please,
Yes.
with an extra large bed, a TV, and one of those little refrigerators you have to open with a key.
After seeing the popularity of the movie, Tiger Electronics produced a real-life version of the movie toy that had the capability to change the tape speed to change the pitch of the original recording. Easy peasy. Are we done here?
Not remotely.
The real Talk Boy with the voice-changing feature did not hit the markets until April of 1993. So whatever happened here is not that simple. So let's take a look at what we have. We have a recorded voice that doesn't sound at all natural, that is repeating the same phrases over and over again. Some of those phrases are demonstrably the same recording. For example, let's take a look at the phrase, "You are being impersonated by the other voice." Before we go any further, I would just like to point out that I am not an audio expert, although I did play one in college, which gave me just enough knowledge to be a danger to myself and those in close proximity. When you overlay the two clips and listen, you can't hear any difference between the two, and the spectrograph of these two clips shows an identical signature. The same is true for the phrase, "keep your eye on the sky" in call number 2. Here's the spectrograph for this one. Same exact sound clip. But then there are other phrases such as, "How long are you going to be back from Texas?" that are different between call 1 and call 2. Both the waveforms and spectrograph show that they don't match. And it's not just that one is stretched out. I tried that too, and it still didn't work. I will say that the second one that is longer sounds a little deeper, like the recorder is running out of batteries and playing slower. But like I said, I tried to stretch one to match the other, and it didn't work. They, in my opinion, are different clips. So if this is a different phrase, why would somebody do that? Why go through all the effort of recording the phrase a second time when you already have it loaded on your tape? And that's not the only instance. When they ask the question, "Is Gary Sudbrink there?" the clip with the stutter from the first call is replaced by a clearer version in calls 3 and 4. Why would he ask, "Who is this?" That seems more than a little random. But let's just say someone has a Walkman or something, and they figured out how to slow it down when playing so the voice sounds deeper. They recorded a bunch of weird phrases, and they're rewinding back to different phrases as they go. In fact, sometimes you can hear noise that sounds like a recorder is being rewound. If that whirring sound is a tape recorder rewinding, how do they know how far to rewind? Well, they probably don't. A couple of the phrases are actually parts of longer phrases. Or maybe they had a few bucks and owned a sampler. You know, something like this. If they are using a sampler, that would make it way easier to throw out random phrases in no particular order. However, it's not just random. There is some order, at least to some of it. The easiest to spot is call number 1. The phrase is Gary Sudbrink there? So how long are you going to be back from Texas? And you're being impersonated by the other voice show up in the same order for the entire call. Same goes for call number 2 with keep your eye on the skies, near Orion, and the full moon. Interestingly enough, the call ends with a new phrase, show double from you. Random, but keep that tidbit in the back of your brain for a moment. Call number 4 starts with some oldies but goodies phrases from the prior 3 calls, but then goes off the rails with a bunch of new ones which are way more intriguing, obvious hints that these are calls being made from someone not of this world. However, put your head into the mind of a punk prankster. You make the calls the first night and hear Gary's dad immediately jump to the assumption that it's an intergalactic person. It would be very easy to add some new phrases overnight to further that idea for the second night. But let's go back to that phrase, show double from you. That phrase is the last phrase spoken in calls 2 and 3, and the second to last in call 4, and nowhere else. That doesn't seem random. If the prankster is using a cassette recorder, their phrases are recorded linearly on the tape, so they would have to know precisely how far back to go on the tape to hit the right phrase at the end. And that is possible. Many cassette players had counters on them. They could have made a note of where on the tape each phrase is recorded. But why go through the trouble? Of course, if they're using a sampler, going back to prior phrases would be as simple as hitting a button. But why use that phrase at the end of the last 3 calls? That implies some kind of structure or message that is certainly not apparent. If this is a prankster trying to fool Gary into thinking he's an alien trying to make contact, then why be this random? You could certainly create phrases that would do a much better job of heating up a tinfoil hat without being too obvious. And if they were using a sampler, how do you account for the growing weakness in the voice? The quality of the voice is much louder and clearer in call 1 than in calls 2 and 3, but it seems to be recharged for the next day for call number 4. I guess whoever this was could be moving the phone further and further away from the source, but why? And the voice in calls 2 and 3 doesn't just sound quieter, it sounds weaker, but not necessarily slowed down. Now, there is a common thread through many MIB stories of these beings seeming to slow down like they're losing energy. One such case is that of Dr. Herbert Hopkins that we cover in another episode. A link to that episode will be in the description if you want to dig deeper, but suffice to say that his story sounds a lot like what you hear on these phone calls. And it's not uncommon for people who have had a UFO sighting to report getting a visit from these mysterious men in black. However, usually that happens within a few days of the sighting. Gary's dad's sighting was way back in 1988. But in the end, I have to say that the chances that someone was just punking Gary are pretty high. But then the question becomes who and why. In the 3 decades since these calls were made, no one has fessed up to being the caller. And let's think about this for a second. Whoever called would have to know Gary's first and last name, his parents' phone number, that he's actually in town staying with his parents, that he lives in Texas, know Mike's phone number, and be able to imitate Gary's voice. It's not his mom or dad. They were in the room. It's most likely not his brothers. Steven was not known to be a prankster kind of guy, and if you're going to go to these lengths to prank your brother, you're going to tell him at some point just so you can see his face. That's how siblings work. It's not his friend Mike. Mike was on the line when the first call came in. It's most likely not Gary playing a hoax on everyone, since he has never sought any kind of attention or money-making opportunities. The case has pretty much really only been discussed at UFO conferences or on panels by other people. Could it be some of his Air Force buddies? Some of them might have known he was gone, and they could probably get their hands on Gary's parents' number. But how would they get Mike's number? And if they're the pranksters, why wouldn't they all have had a good laugh at Gary's expense when he got back to Texas? Gary has done some interviews over the years, but it's not like he's out there trying to sell a book, trying to promote himself and his story. But in the end, all of these possibilities still leave the lingering question of why? What's the motive? A prank is no fun if there isn't a payoff. It could be a random stranger. Never underestimate the creativity of a bored teenager. And the payoff is the laughs of knowing you pulled it off. But a random punk is not going to know all of the details necessary to pull off these calls. But before you put everything together in your head to make a decision on this creepy case, you might want to pump those brakes a little, because just like I like to eat my cake, sometimes I leave the frosting for last. A year earlier, Steven is on the highway driving to his wedding when he sees Gary pull up next to him in his car, makes some faces at him, and then keeps driving. Steven thinks, that's odd, but hey, it's my wedding day. And he's just glad to see his brother made it in from Texas to be there. The funny thing is, Steven didn't tell Gary anything about this until after he'd heard about the creepy phone calls. And Gary didn't bring his car for the wedding. He flew in, so his car is back in Texas. Gary says he never saw his brother on the highway, much less make faces at him. But Steven is adamant that whoever it was looked just like Gary and had the same car as Gary. Kind of puts a new spin on the phrase from the phone calls that says, shows double from you. And considering the phone call to his friend Mike the day before, the phrase, you're being impersonated by the other voice, also becomes very interesting. So if you take all these events together, the phone calls, the impersonated call to his friend Mike, the weird guys at the airport and on the plane from Texas to New York, maybe even his dad's UFO sighting. If you take all of that as one giant collection of weirdness surrounding Gary, the theory of a random prankster becomes next to impossible just because of the immense amount of planning involved and knowledge required. Oh, add to the mix that as his mom was being treated for cancer back in 2000, the clinic told her that her daughter had called asking how her renal function was doing. But Gary doesn't have any sisters. And if you separate them, the phone calls being independent of the other weirdness, then what's up with this average Long Islander who attracts so many bizarre happenings? The odds of that seem equally as unlikely. And even if you put all of the extra information aside and consider this just a series of prank calls, how creepy is that? Someone calling you knowing all of these things about you, and you have no idea who it is or what they want. Even in the simplest of terms, this ranks very high on my creepy meter. The only thing creepier is,
We've traced the call. It's coming from inside the house.
but whatever happened, Gary has not received another call from said creep and has just continued living his life in relative quiet, working as a pharmacist in Pennsylvania. No one has been able to figure out who or what placed those calls. But you never know. He was under 30 when all this happened, which makes him less than 60 years old today. Chances are he's got plenty of time left on this earth. What if this creep is playing the long game? I don't know about you, but after hearing those calls, I feel like I need a shower. Creepy! If you want to go deeper, I did read a book that went much deeper into Gary's dad's connections with the UFO world. It's only a small part of the book, but I'll put a link to it in the description below if you want to take a look. If you would prefer to stick around for more unnatural creepiness, go ahead and click right here. Be careful out there, and I will see you here again on the In-Between.